Hi, I'm Isabella Carter. Last Saturday night, I walked into my husband's family reunion with a stack of note cards and a hopeful smile, and walked out with my voice stripped bare in front of 30 people. My cheeks burning, my hands shaking, and my dignity flattened under the weight of their stares. My husband mocked me. His mother smirked. His cousin chuckled and said, "Gus, we're in for a pity party." And not one person told them to stop. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part, it wasn't just one night. It was years of public jabs, private dismissals, and quiet betrayals that all piled into that warm, wine-scented hall. So, what do you think happened after my son stood up from his chair and walked toward me? Before we dive in, tell me, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. I read everyone. The reunion was held at the Cannon Beach Community Hall, a place that smelled faintly of old pine and salt from the ocean drifting in through the cracked windows. Yellow pendant lights glared down on round tables dressed in white cloth, the kind that show every spill. I'd spent the week preparing this speech. My chance to thank those who'd supported my new bookstore and maybe, just maybe, bridge the gulf between me and Mark's family. I stood at the small wooden podium, the microphone colder than I expected against my fingers. Thank you all for being here tonight. Mark's voice cut in, loud enough to slice through the hum of the room. Oh, folks, better settle in for the long-awaited sob story. Nevin laughter broke out, some sharp, some hesitant, all of it digging under my skin. My eyes caught Susan, my mother-in-law, leaning back in her chair with a smile that never touched her eyes. She whispered to her husband, and he chuckled, low but deliberate. The smell of red wine hung heavy, mixed with perfume, and the faint tang of salt air. My glass of water trembled in my hand, the surface rippling. My lips pressed into a straight line. As I was saying. But my voice faltered, not because I'd forgotten the words, but because the weight of every similar moment was pressing on my chest. The barbecue last summer where Mark joked about my bookkeeping skills in front of his friends. The Christmas Eve dinner when he told my sister I was too sensitive to handle real life. The way those comments always landed with a laugh track from people who should have known better. Liam sat 3 tables away, his chair angled so he could see me. 14 years old, taller every month, but still with that stubborn set to his jaw when something wasn't right. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, eyes locked on mine. Mark leaned back, folding his arms, the picture of ease. Go on, Iz. Make it good. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. The note cards in my hand blurred under the light. For a second, I thought about stepping down, walking out to the dark parking lot where the sea breeze would hit me clean and cold. But then Liam moved. The scrape of his chair on the wooden floor sliced through the murmur of the room. He stood up, his voice clear and steady. Dad, that's not funny. Mom's worked harder than anyone here. You should be proud. A silence, the kind that presses in from all sides. Mark's grin faltered, his jaw tightening. Susan's smile disappeared like someone had switched off a light. A few cousins stared down at their laps. The air felt different. Thicker, heavier, but not in the way it had a moment ago. This wasn't humiliation. This was possibility, the smallest crack in a wall that had stood for years. I swallowed, the lump in my throat easing just enough to speak. Thank you, Liam. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Mark shifted in his chair, glancing around as if searching for a rescue that wasn't coming. He picked up his wine glass, drained it, and set it down harder than he needed to. I finished the speech, my words steadier than I expected, though I couldn't tell you exactly what I said. What I do remember is the way Liam stayed standing until I was done, his eyes never leaving mine. When it ended, there was polite applause, scattered and thin. But I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel alone. Because here's the thing. Public betrayal doesn't start in public. It starts in the quiet, in the comments you let slide, in the smiles that cut more than they comfort. And if someone's going to break that pattern, sometimes it's not you. Sometimes it's the person you've been trying to protect. I wasn't always the woman standing under those harsh pendant lights, clutching a microphone like it was the only thing keeping me upright. 7 years ago, mornings smelled like coffee and ocean air drifting through the cracked window of our rented duplex in Portland. Mark would hum along to the radio while pouring cereal into Liam's bowl, his lucky blue mug steaming in front of him. The kitchen was cramped, the counter scarred, but it felt like the center of our little world. Back then, laughter was easy. I'd dance in my slippers to some 90s tune, hair a mess, cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. Liam would squeal, clapping his small hands when Mark spun me around. We talked about dreams between sips of coffee. His, a surf rental by the coast; mine, a bookstore where people could lose themselves for hours. When the resort job opened in Cannon Beach, it felt like a sign. Mark could chase his career, and I could be closer to the ocean I loved. I left my steady library job without hesitation, telling myself it was for the family. We moved into a modest house just a few streets from the shore. I pictured walks on the sand, new friends, a tighter bond between us. At first, it almost happened. There were picnics on the beach, Saturday trips to the farmer's market, evenings when the air smelled of salt and fresh bread. I took freelance assignments so I could handle school pickups, dinners, and homework. Mark worked late, but I told myself it was temporary. The first cracks came quietly. A missed dinner here, a forgotten birthday there. Work's crazy right now, he'd say, kissing the top of my head like punctuation. I believed him. After all, sacrifices were part of the deal. We were building something, weren't we? But small things began to shift. His jokes about my little projects were more pointed, especially when others could hear. Once, at a neighborhood barbecue, I mentioned I was saving for the bookstore. He grinned and told the group, "Gus will all get free bookmarks when it fails." They laughed. I laughed too, but later, the words clung like damp air. I poured myself into the house, sanding secondhand furniture, sewing curtains from discounted fabric. I kept dreaming, sketching ideas for a shop that smelled like new paper and worn wood, with a nook where sunlight pooled in the afternoons. But each time I shared something I was proud of, there was a line from him. Quick, sharp, dressed as humor. That made the room chuckle and me shrink just a little more. It was easy to ignore at first. After all, he wasn't the man who'd make a scene, not yet. Or maybe I just didn't want to see how close he was getting. The spring Liam turned 12. I was invited to speak at a women's networking brunch. 10 minutes to share my story about starting a small business from scratch. I'd spent nights practicing in front of the bathroom mirror, imagining a room full of women nodding along. Mark offered to drive me, said he wanted to support me. But when I stepped up to the microphone, I caught sight of him at the back, leaning toward a friend. They both laughed at something, their eyes flicking to me. My throat tightened. The neat sentences I'd rehearsed slipped out of order. I made it through, but the applause sounded thin, almost polite. That day lingered in my mind like the smell of burnt toast. Small, but impossible to ignore. I started noticing other moments. The way he'd cut me off mid-story at dinner parties. How he'd call my work cute when I signed a new client. It wasn't outright cruelty. It was erosion. When I finally opened Isabella's nook, a little shop wedged between a bakery and a thrift store, Mark came to the ribbon cutting. He stayed 15 minutes, checking his phone between posed smiles. In the photo from that day, I'm holding the scissors, grinning, he's glancing at the screen in his hand. I told myself it didn't matter. My dream was real, and that was enough. But dreams don't erase patterns. His interruptions grew bolder, his audience larger. And I got better at swallowing the sting, smoothing the edges, pretending not to care. Still, there were bright spots. Evenings when the bookstore smelled of cinnamon from the bakery next door, and Liam would do homework in the reading nook. Saturday mornings when the sun broke through the clouds and the tide pulled clean lines into the sand. Those moments kept me steady, even as the ground under my marriage shifted. Looking back, I see it clearly. The reunion wasn't an isolated blow. It was the natural endpoint of years spent shrinking my voice so his could fill the room. And maybe I would have kept doing it, if not for Liam. That night, when his chair scraped back across the wooden floor, it was like a match striking dry tinder. I didn't know yet how much would change. But I knew this. Once you've been defended in public by someone who sees your worth, it's hard to go back to pretending you don't deserve better. It didn't take long for the next hit to land. 2 weeks after the reunion, Mark and I attended a charity dinner at the resort where he worked. The dining room smelled of cedar paneling and lemon polish, the kind of scent that makes you stand taller without knowing why. Strings of white lights coiled around the beams, and waiters moved between tables with plates of salmon and glasses of sparkling water. I wasn't there as anyone's guest of honor. I was there as Mark's wife. I'd grown used to that title in settings like this, though it still caught in my chest sometimes. I wore a navy dress I'd found at a thrift store. A perfect fit, the fabric soft against my skin. As we were seated, Mark leaned over, voice low enough for only me to hear. "Try not to mention the bookstore tonight. This isn't that kind of crowd." I smiled tightly. The way you do when you don't want to start something in public. The first course arrived. Roasted beet salad with goat cheese. And the conversation flowed around me. Talk of vacation homes, golf trips, and investment portfolios. I listened, nodding when appropriate. Then someone asked me what I did for work. I felt my shoulders lift slightly, ready to share about the store, the community events, the book club that had just reached 20 members. But before I could speak, Mark chuckled and said, "She runs a little shop. Mostly sells coffee table books to tourists." Laughter bubbled up from two people across the table. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I could have corrected him. I could have explained that the store was turning a profit, that I'd built it from nothing but grit and late nights. Instead, I let the moment pass, swallowing both the salad and the words that wanted to spill out. The rest of the evening blurred into snippets, the clink of silverware, the pop of a champagne cork, the feel of the linen napkin twisted in my lap. I laughed where expected, stayed quiet where safer. On the drive home, the silence was thick, broken only by the sound of tires on wet pavement. At home, I kicked off my shoes and walked into the kitchen. The faint smell of the sea drifted in through the open window, mingling with the scent of leftover coffee in the pot. Mark poured himself a drink, not looking at me. "You're getting too sensitive about these things," he said, as if reading from a script he'd practiced for years. I didn't respond. I'd learned that answering often invited another blow. But inside, something small shifted. The reunion had left a mark, and now this. This was confirmation. He wasn't just careless with his words. He was deliberate. And the more I stayed silent, the more room he had to perform. A week later, it happened again. This time in our own living room, in front of Chloe. She'd dropped by after work, still in her scrubs from the clinic. We were sipping tea, talking about a community fundraiser I was planning, when Mark walked in. "You're not still wasting time on that, are you?" he said, tossing his jacket onto the couch. Chloe's eyes flicked to mine, her lips pressing into a thin line. She changed the subject, but the damage was done. Even in my own home, I was fair game. After Chloe left, I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing our mugs, the warm water running over my hands until it went cold. Mark was in the living room, flipping through TV channels like the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. I could hear the faint hum of his voice talking to the dog. Light and casual, the way he saved for an audience. I dried my hands slowly, listening to the rhythm of the rain tapping against the windows. A thought crept in. If Chloe hadn't been there, would his words have been sharper? Louder? Or maybe he saved his most cutting remarks for the moments when someone else could witness them, like a private joke he wanted to share with the room. The next weekend proved it. We were invited to a small get-together at our neighbor's house. Nothing fancy. Burgers on the grill. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce hanging in the air. Kids darted across the yard, laughter spilling over the sound of a classic rock playlist. I was chatting with Kelly, the neighbor's wife, about summer reading programs for the local kids. Her eyes lit up when I mentioned a donation drive at my store. "That's fantastic, Isabella. The community really needs that kind of effort." Before I could thank her, Mark appeared at my side, arm sliding loosely around my waist. "She's passionate, I'll give her that," he said with a grin, "even if it doesn't exactly pay the bills." Kelly's smile faltered. I felt heat rise up my neck, the smell of smoke suddenly too thick in my lungs. I excused myself to check on the kids and walked toward the far end of the yard, where the shadows stretched long under the setting sun. Standing there, I could still hear the muted hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a familiar sound, one I'd come to associate with being the butt of the joke. Later that night, back at home, I asked him why he did it. His answer was a shrug and, "Relax, people know I'm kidding." But I wasn't relaxed. I wasn't even angry in the way I used to be, quick to flare and then burn out. This was different. This was a cold, steady understanding that these weren't harmless slips. They were a pattern, reinforced every time I stayed quiet. Liam noticed too. I caught him watching us at dinner, his fork pushing food around his plate. "You okay, Mom?" he asked once, after Mark left the table to take a call. I smiled and said I was fine, because that was easier than explaining the weight of years to a 14-year-old. But in the quiet of my bookstore the next morning, as I shelved a stack of paperbacks, the air smelling of cinnamon from the bakery next door, I realized something. The more he chipped away at me, the more I had to decide whether I'd let him finish the job or finally make him stop. I didn't know yet how that would happen, but I knew this: the next time he tried, I wouldn't be standing there alone. The first time I noticed something wrong with our finances, it was a Tuesday morning. The store was quiet, sunlight pooling through the front windows, dust drifting in the beams. I'd taken my laptop to the counter to pay a few bills before opening. The smell of cinnamon rolls from the bakery next door lingered in the air. I logged into our joint account and stared at the numbers. The balance was far lower than I expected, low enough to make my chest tighten. I clicked through the transaction history. There it was, a wire transfer for $15,000. The note field was blank. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I refreshed the page. Still there. I pulled out my phone and called Mark. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped. "I'm in a meeting. Can this wait?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Where did $15,000 go?" He sighed, the kind of sigh meant to make me feel like I was overreacting. "It's an investment opportunity. A friend needed quick capital for a development deal. Short term, high return. I'll double it in a few months." I closed my eyes, picturing the checkbook I'd balanced the night before. "You didn't tell me. I didn't think you'd understand. It's business." And just like that, he hung up. I sat there, my hand still holding the phone, the weight of his words settling in. It wasn't just the money. It was the assumption that my input didn't matter. That my role was to keep the house running, the kid fed, the lights on, while he made real decisions. That night, I tried to bring it up again over dinner. Liam was upstairs, music faint through the ceiling. "You can't just pull money out like that, Mark," I said, keeping my voice low. He speared a piece of chicken, not looking at me. "It's my income that fills that account. I shouldn't have to get permission." "It's our account," I reminded him. "We agreed. Big decisions together." He smirked. "You're acting like I gambled it away." Relax. The word hit harder than it should have. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. In the years we'd been together, we'd talked about almost everything. Until we didn't. A week later, I stopped at the ATM on my way to pick up supplies for the store. The machine spat out my card with a message in block letters: Seshra's insufficient funds. I stood there, the autumn air biting at my neck, the metallic smell of the machine mingling with exhaust from the street. Back at the store, I pulled up the account again. Another withdrawal. Smaller this time, but enough to cover a mortgage payment. I printed the statement, the paper warm in my hands, and slid it into a folder. I didn't know exactly why I was saving it yet. Only that it felt important. That evening, Mark breezed in after work, smelling of the resort's cologne. Heavy lobby. "Don't wait up," he said, grabbing a jacket. "Late client dinner." I watched him go, the folder tucked into my bag under the counter. For the first time, I wasn't just upset. I was making a record. The following weekend, Liam and I stopped at the grocery store after closing the shop. The cart was half full. Bread, milk, a jar of strawberry jam he'd picked out. When my card was declined, the cashier, a teenager with chipped black nail polish, repeated it softly, like maybe I hadn't heard. I paid with cash from the store's register, but the walk back to the car felt heavier than the bags in my hands. Liam didn't say anything, but I could see the question in his eyes. I forced a smile. "Bank glitch," I told him. He didn't press, but he didn't look convinced either. At home, I waited until he was upstairs before I opened my laptop again. Another withdrawal. This time, 5,000. The description field read simply, "Private event deposit." My hands hovered over the keyboard. I knew better than to call Mark while he was out. The last time I'd done that, his tone had been sharp enough to slice through my resolve for days. On Monday, I walked into the bank. The carpet smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the pen at the counter was chained down. I asked for a printout of the last 3 months. The teller handed it over, her eyes flicking to mine for a moment longer than usual. Back at the store, I sat in the reading nook with the statements spread out in front of me. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Payments to luxury restaurants I'd never set foot in, and that $15,000 wire at the top like a flag I couldn't unsee. I started a new folder. This one labeled in plain black marker, Asaro's household. The act felt small, but deliberate. Each page I slid inside seemed to harden something in me. That night, when Mark came home, the smell of whiskey hit me before he shut the door. "We need to talk," I said. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the entryway, not meeting my eyes. "If this is about the bank account again." "It is." I cut in. My voice was calm, even. "And about the fact that you've been taking money without telling me." "Our money?" His jaw tightened. "I'm providing for this family. You sell paperbacks to tourists. There's a difference." The words landed cold. I didn't argue, not out loud. But inside, something final clicked into place. This wasn't just disrespect. It was theft, dressed in entitlement. Later, lying in bed, I could hear the faint crash of waves through the open window. My mind replayed the moments on loop: the ATM error, the grocery store decline, his smirk at the dinner table. Each one a notch in a pattern I could no longer ignore. I thought about my mother, how she used to say, "If someone shows you they can't be trusted with the little things, don't give them the big ones." The next morning, I opened a new bank account in my name only. I moved what little I could from my business earnings into it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I walked back to the store, the salty air filling my lungs, I realized I didn't feel guilty. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Maybe even in control. I didn't have all the answers yet. But I had a folder full of proof, a bank account with my name on it, and a quiet plan forming in the space between each breath. By the end of that month, the air around me felt different. Not the crisp, salt air that swept in from the Pacific, but something heavier, thick with the weight of conversations I wasn't being invited into. Glances that shifted when I walked into the room. It started with the neighborhood book club I'd hosted for 3 years without fail, brewing coffee and setting out lemon bars from the bakery next door. But this time, when I texted about the upcoming meeting, no one responded for 2 days. When the replies finally trickled in, they were polite but vague. Maybe next month. I'm swamped with work. The kind of messages that left no space to push back. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. People were busy. Schedules clashed. But the same week, I ran into Kelly outside the grocery store. She gave me a quick smile, but her eyes darted away before I could mention the fundraiser we'd talked about. "I've got to run," she said, adjusting the strap on her bag like it was suddenly cutting into her shoulder. By Friday, it was impossible to ignore. Chloe stopped by the shop after work, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee. She leaned against the counter, her voice low. "You know Mark's been talking," she said. I froze. "Talking how?" She hesitated, making it sound like the store is draining you. That you're neglecting things at home. I don't buy it, but others might. The words landed like a stone in my stomach. Mark wasn't just undermining me in the moment anymore. He was laying the groundwork behind my back. It explained the strained smiles, the clipped conversations. He was drawing a circle, and I was outside of it. That weekend, Liam had a soccer game. The sidelines were crowded with parents in folding chairs, the smell of damp grass and sunscreen hanging in the air. Normally, I'd chat with the other moms, swapping stories about school projects and weekend plans. But that day, when I walked up, the group shifted slightly, like water closing over a rock. I ended up standing alone, clapping quietly when Liam scored. After the game, he jogged over, his hair damp, cheeks flushed. "Did you see that shot?" he asked. "I did," I said, forcing a smile. "It was perfect." He grinned, but his eyes searched mine like he could see past the expression I'd passed it on. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, with a mug of tea gone cold. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "Won't be home. Client thing." No apology. No explanation. The loneliness settled over me like a second skin. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being unseen. Even in rooms full of people, I was invisible. I thought about calling an old friend from Portland, but it had been so long. Too many. "We should catch up sometime." Texts left unanswered. I pictured her looking at my name on the screen, wondering what had taken me so long to reach out. And the thought made me put the phone back down. In the quiet, I realized Chloe was the only one still speaking to me without that careful, measured tone. The only one who seemed to believe I wasn't the version of myself Mark was selling. The following week, I hosted a small community event at the bookstore. A local author reading, nothing extravagant. I'd set out folding chairs in neat rows, brewed coffee, and laid out a plate of shortbread cookies from the bakery next door. The smell of sugar and butter filled the air, softening the usual scent of paper and wood polish. At start time, only 5 people came. 2 were tourists who'd wandered in off the street. The rest were Chloe, a college student from the coffee shop, and an older man who lived down the block. I smiled, made small talk, and introduced the author, but inside, the emptiness of the room pressed against my ribs. Later, Chloe helped me stack the chairs. "It's not you," she said quietly. "Word gets around fast in a small town. He's been planting seeds." I nodded, though I didn't trust my voice to answer. That Sunday, we went to Mark's parents' house for dinner. The table was set with the usual roast chicken and potatoes, the smell of rosemary heavy in the air. But the conversation was different. Tighter. Each time I tried to join in, about the new boardwalk renovations, or a book I'd read, someone would redirect the topic, sliding around my words like they weren't there. When dessert came, Susan asked about the store in that falsely bright tone she used for gossip she'd already heard. "Still keeping you busy?" she said, slicing a too large piece of pie. "Yes," I said. "We've had some great." Mark interrupted, smiling toward her. "She's hanging in there. We'll see if it makes it through the winter." They all chuckled lightly. My fork hovered over the plate, the smell of cinnamon suddenly too sharp. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I just took a bite of pie I couldn't taste. By the time we got home, the walls felt closer. I walked into the bookstore early the next morning, letting the bell above the door chime in the empty space. The quiet was different here. Honest, without pretense. I ran my fingers along the spines of books, their familiar texture grounding me. Mid-morning, a delivery arrived. A box of new releases I'd ordered weeks ago. As I unpacked them, I thought about the friends I'd had in Portland, the ones who knew me before Mark's version of me existed. I wondered if I could find my way back to that woman. Or if she was gone entirely. That afternoon, a mother and daughter came in, the little girl tugging a worn paperback from her backpack. "Do you have the next one in this series?" she asked, her eyes bright. I found it for her, watching her hug it to her chest. The mother smiled at me, genuine and unguarded. For a moment, I felt visible again. After they left, I sat behind the counter, the sunlight catching dust in the air. I thought about Chloe's words, about the shrinking circle around me, and about the one person, my son, who had stepped inside it when it mattered most. The isolation was real, but so was the proof that not everyone believed the version of me Mark was trying to sell. That sliver of truth was enough to keep me moving, even if I had to walk the next stretch of this road alone. The invitation arrived in the mail, thick cream cardstock with gold lettering that practically screamed importance. Mark's Resort was hosting its annual summer gala. A night of champagne, music, and the kind of schmoozing he lived for. He left it on the kitchen counter like an afterthought, but I knew better. This was the event where the right smile or handshake could make his next promotion happen. The night of the gala, Cannon Beach glowed under a summer sunset, the air warm with the scent of salt and blooming hydrangeas. I wore a simple black dress, one I'd bought years ago but still fit perfectly. Liam was staying over at Chloe's, his choice after I told him where we were going. "Just call me if you need anything," he'd said, eyes serious. The resort ballroom was all glass and polished wood, chandeliers casting warm pools of light. A string quartet played in the corner, the soft notes floating above the murmur of voices and the clink of crystal. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, the bubbles catching the light like scattered stars. Mark thrived here. He worked the room like it was his stage, shaking hands, laughing loudly, leaning in close to whisper something that made his companions smile. I followed a step behind, offering polite nods, sipping my champagne slowly. It happened halfway through the evening. One of Mark's colleagues, a tall man with silver hair and a white smile, asked how my bookstore was doing. I opened my mouth, ready to talk about the summer reading program we'd launched for local kids. But Mark stepped in, hand resting lightly on my back. "Oh, she's keeping busy. You know, it's more of a passion project than a business." His voice was warm, almost affectionate, just enough to sound harmless to someone who didn't know better. The silver-haired man chuckled. "Keeps you out of trouble, right?" The Mark grinned. "Exactly. And hey, if it doesn't work out, she can always join the resort gift shop team. At least then she'd sell something people actually buy." The laughter around us swelled, sharp and bright like breaking glass. My stomach twisted. I caught the faint smell of his cologne. Clean, expensive, suffocating. I wanted to step away, to vanish into the crowd, but my feet stayed rooted to the polished floor. I managed a thin smile, the kind that hides everything. "Excuse me," I said, and turned toward the bar. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step echoing in my ears. I ordered sparkling water, the fizz stinging my throat. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mark still holding court, gesturing toward me with a laugh I couldn't hear over the music. My hands tightened around the glass, condensation slipping between my fingers. Chloe appeared at my side, dressed in a deep green gown, her hair pulled back in a sleek knot. I heard what he said. She murmured. I shrugged, though the motion felt brittle. "It's fine." "It's not fine," she said. "You don't have to keep letting him do that." I looked down at the bubbles rising in my glass. Tonight's not the night. She didn't argue, but her eyes stayed on me a moment longer before she melted back into the crowd. I stood there, the hum of voices washing over me, the music swelling and dipping like a tide I couldn't escape. Somewhere inside, a decision was forming. Not loud yet, but steady. Dinner was served in courses: seared scallops with citrus glaze, roast duck, chocolate torta. But I barely tasted any of it. The laughter from our table seemed to swell at random moments, each burst landing in my chest like a small punch. I kept my head down, pushing food around my plate, pretending not to notice when Mark made a sweeping gesture toward me during some story I wasn't invited to finish. After dessert, the resort's general manager took the stage to thank donors. His voice boomed over the sound system, the room settling into polite attention. Mark leaned toward a group at our table, speaking in that low, fox conspiratorial tone he used when he wanted his words to feel like an inside joke. I caught only the tail end. At least she looks good tonight. Makes the investment worth it. It wasn't loud enough for everyone, but it was loud enough for me. And for the woman seated beside him, who looked away, embarrassed for us both. The words rang in my ears, drowning out the applause that followed the manager's speech. I set my napkin on the table and stood, the scrape of my chair louder than I intended. Mark glanced up, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before sliding back into place. I walked toward the terrace doors, my heels clicking against the hardwood, the cool night air rushing to meet me when I stepped outside. The ocean was a dark mass beyond the resort grounds, its steady roar mixing with the faint music drifting from inside. I gripped the railing, letting the salt wind sting my eyes. Behind me, the door opened. Eyes. Chloe's voice, soft but urgent. She stepped beside me, her gown swaying in the breeze. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, the lie tasting metallic. "Just needed some air." She studied me. "You know what he's doing, right? This is the third time tonight." "I know." The admission was a whisper. "You don't have to take it." I shook my head, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Not here? Not tonight." "But—" my voice trailed off. There was no need to finish. The thought was already burning in my chest. I couldn't let this keep happening. When we returned inside, Mark was near the bar, laughing with a cluster of guests. He caught sight of me, lifted his glass slightly, and mouthed, "There you are." Like I'd wandered off without permission. I stayed at the edge of the room until the event wound down, offering polite goodbyes, shaking hands when necessary. Mark seemed buoyant as we left, chattering about potential deals, people he'd impressed. He didn't notice I barely responded. In the car, the silence between us was thick. The dashboard lights cast his face in sharp relief, every confident line of it. "You were quiet tonight," he said finally. "Nothing to add," I replied, watching the road vanish under the headlights. He chuckled, as if I'd confirmed something for him. "See? You're better when you just relax and enjoy." I turned to the window, letting the streetlights blur into streaks of gold. My reflection looked back at me. Smaller than I remembered, but sharper too. When we pulled into the driveway, Mark went inside first, already loosening his tie. I stayed in the car for a moment, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. In that pause, I understood something clearly: humiliation loses its sting when it turns into evidence. The next time he tried, I wouldn't just endure it. I'd use it. So tell me, if someone kept cutting you down in public, in front of the very people they wanted to impress, would you fight back right there, or wait until you could end it for good? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. The email from Chloe arrived on a Wednesday morning, just as I was unpacking a shipment of fall releases at the bookstore. The cardboard smelled faintly of ink and dust, my fingers catching on the edges of the tape. Her subject line was simple: "You should see this." I clicked it open, the hum of the overhead lights suddenly too loud. There, attached, was a PDF of an email thread. The sender was Mark. The recipients, two of his colleagues at the resort, and a man I didn't know. The first line hit me like a punch. She's been pouring everything into that little store, but honestly, it's just a matter of time before it folds. I've been covering more at home, and it's taking a toll. The words bled into each other as I scrolled, but one sentence stood out in bold relief. I might be able to convince her to sell the property if she starts falling behind on bills. Could be a good spot for a cafe expansion. I sat back in my chair, the smell of cinnamon from the bakery next door suddenly sickly sweet. My bookstore, my safe place, my dream, wasn't just something he dismissed in passing. It was a target. The bell above the door jingled, and I quickly minimized the screen. A regular customer wandered in, asking for a recommendation for her niece. I smiled, my voice steady, even as my pulse pounded in my ears. When she left, I locked the door, flipped the sign to "Back in 15", and reopened the file. The thread went on for weeks. Little updates about my schedule, my sales, even notes about who stopped by the store. He was tracking me, feeding pieces of my life to people who saw my shop as a real estate opportunity. I called Chloe. "Where did you get this?" She hesitated. "A nurse I know is dating one of the resort staff. He left his laptop open at a coffee shop. She saw your name and sent it to me." I don't think this is the only conversation he's had. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "He's planning to take it from me," I said, more to myself than to her. "You need to be careful," Chloe warned. "If he thinks you know, he might move faster." I hung up and stared at the computer screen. My first instinct was to confront him, to demand an explanation, but the part of me that had been quietly collecting bank statements and remembering every public dig knew better. Confrontation without preparation would be a gift to him. I started printing every email in the thread, the warm pages stacking on the counter. I slid them into the same folder that now held months of financial statements, each piece fitting into a puzzle I hadn't known I was building. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't about his ego anymore. This was about control, ownership, and the belief that I wouldn't fight back. I unlocked the front door, flipping the sign to "Open." Again. Customers came and went, their voices a soft murmur over the chime of the bell. I answered questions, rang up sales, smiled when needed. All the while, the folder sat hidden in the back office, its weight a reminder that the story Mark thought he was writing wasn't the only one in motion. That night, after closing the shop, I walked along the beach instead of heading straight home. The tide was low, the air sharp with the scent of seaweed and salt. Each wave that broke seemed to echo the pulse in my ears. I thought about every offhand remark, every withheld conversation, every "relax" eyes that had chipped away at me. Now I could see the shape of it, how it all led here. When I finally pulled into the driveway, Mark's car was there. Lights glowed from the kitchen window. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. He was at the counter, scrolling through his phone, a glass of whiskey beside him. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Busy day at the store," I replied evenly, hanging my coat on the back of a chair. I didn't mention that part of my day had been spent reading proof of his plans to sell it out from under me. He poured another splash into his glass. "You should think about scaling back. Winter's coming. Not much foot traffic." I studied him for a moment, wondering if he had any idea I knew. "I'll manage," I said, keeping my voice light. Then I excused myself to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. In the quiet, I pulled the folder from my bag and spread the papers across the bed. The bank statements, the printed emails, the notes I'd started keeping after each public humiliation. It all painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I took photos of everything, uploading them to a cloud account under a name no one would associate with me. Over the next few days, I started noticing more. Phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. Receipts in his jacket pocket for lunches with names I didn't recognize. Small comments about making smart business moves, dropped into casual conversation. On Friday, Chloe stopped by the shop after work. She wore that same concerned crease between her brows. "You've seen it all, haven't you?" "I have enough," I said. "More than enough." She looked at the folder on the counter. "So what now?" "I wait," I told her. "And I keep collecting." That weekend, Mark mentioned he had a meeting about potential expansions. He said it with the same careless tone he used when telling me he was going to the hardware store. I nodded, asked no questions. But as soon as he left, I called Chloe. "I think he's moving sooner than I thought," I said. "If he makes an offer on that property, I need to be ready." "You will be," she said. "Just don't let him see you flinch." By Sunday night, the folder had grown. I'd added screenshots of messages Chloe had forwarded me, little exchanges between Mark and his contacts. They weren't explicit, but they were enough to show intent. And intent, paired with the rest of what I had, was a foundation. Lying in bed, I listened to him in the next room, laughing into the phone. The sound no longer made me feel small. It made me steady. Each word, each plan was another piece in my case. I didn't know exactly how the end would look yet. But for the first time, I could see that there would be one. And that I'd be the one writing it. That night, I didn't bother turning off the lamp. The bedroom was dim, shadows pooling in the corners, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence. Mark had fallen asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even. I lay on my side, staring at the ceiling, the folder of documents tucked under the bed, within easy reach. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind looped through the last few months, the bank withdrawals, the gala humiliation, the email Chloe had sent. Every scene was sharper now. Each word replayed in the exact tone it had been delivered. It felt like I'd been watching my own life from the outside, waiting for the moment I could step back in. Around midnight, I slipped out of bed. The floor was cold under my bare feet as I padded to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water, but it just sat on the counter while I stared out the window at the dark street. A single street lamp cast its cone of light onto the wet pavement. The air beyond the glass seemed to hum with the same restless energy in my chest. I sat at the table, pulling the folder into the glow of the lamp. Page by page, I went through everything again. Bank statements, printed emails, screenshots. My notes were scrawled in the margins, dates and small reminders to myself. This wasn't just a collection of moments anymore, it was a map of his choices. And a map could be used to chart the way out. The clock ticked toward 2 a.m. I thought about calling Chloe, but she had an early shift at the clinic. Instead, I opened my laptop and started a new document. I titled it simply Sucks Plan. I listed what I had: 1. Proof of unauthorized withdrawals. 2. Emails discussing selling the store property. 3. Witness accounts, Chloe's, potentially others. 4. My own timeline of public humiliations. Then I listed what I needed: 1. Copies of property records. 2. Confirmation of whose name was on the deed. 3. Any contracts he might be negotiating without me. Each item steadied me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building. By 3 a.m., I was exhausted but wide awake. I pushed back from the table, my chair legs scraping softly on the floor. The smell of coffee from earlier in the day still lingered faintly in the air. I poured the cold water back into the sink and rinsed the glass. Every movement felt deliberate, like I was marking my place in a story I finally had control over. When I returned to the bedroom, Mark shifted in his sleep but didn't wake. I slid back under the covers, staring at the faint outline of the curtains against the streetlight outside. I knew tomorrow would come too soon, and with it, the same careful dance I'd been doing for years. But something had shifted during these sleepless hours. It wasn't just resolve. It was readiness. The next morning, the world looked the same, but I didn't feel the same moving through it. Mark was already gone when I came into the kitchen, a note on the counter in his quick, slanted handwriting. Out early. Dinner late. No explanation, no question of what I might need. I slid the note into the folder before making coffee. The bitter scent filled the kitchen, grounding me as I opened my laptop. I started with the county records office website, the kind of place where property documents sat buried behind clunky search tools. After 20 minutes of navigating down menus and broken links, I found it. The deed to the building my bookstore occupied. My name was there alongside Mark's. That one detail was enough to confirm he couldn't sell it without my signature. But it also told me something else. He'd been lying when he implied he had full control. I took a screenshot, labeling it with the date and time, then saved it to the hidden cloud folder. Next, I searched for any new business filings under his name. Nothing yet, but that didn't mean plans weren't in motion. If he'd learned anything in the years we'd been together, it was how to keep the surface calm while working the currents underneath. By late morning, I was at the bookstore. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, the air cool and faintly sweet from the bakery next door. I brewed a pot of tea, sat in the reading nook, and began sorting through the folder again. This time, I arranged everything chronologically, building a clean, undeniable story from the first bank withdrawal to Chloe's email. I paused over a photo from the store's opening day. Me in a blue dress, smiling into the camera while holding the ribbon, cutting scissors. In the background, Mark stood slightly apart, glancing at his phone. I'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now it felt like a perfect snapshot of the gap that had grown between us. Around noon, Chloe stopped by. She dropped her bag on the counter, her eyes scanning my face. "You didn't sleep much." I shook my head. "I worked." Her gaze fell on the folder. "You've got enough to bury him." "Not yet," I said. "But I will." She nodded slowly. "Just be smart about it. He's not going to play fair when he realizes you're ahead." After she left, I locked the door for lunch break and sat alone in the quiet. The tea had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitterness reminded me I was awake, alert. By evening, I had a checklist taped inside the back cover of the folder. Tasks to complete, people to contact, documents to secure. Each item was small on its own, but together they formed a path forward. When I got home, the house was dark. Mark hadn't returned yet. I set the folder in its place under the bed, changed into pajamas, and made myself a simple dinner. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, but purposeful. I knew the sleepless nights weren't over, but they no longer felt like drifting in the dark. Now they were hours I could use. Hours to plan, to prepare, to make sure that when the moment came, I wouldn't just survive it. I'd own it. I started the week by opening a second savings account in my name only. The bank smelled faintly of copier toner and floor polish, the air too cool from the humming vents. The teller didn't ask questions beyond the scripted ones, and I kept my voice calm, steady, as I transferred a modest sum from my business account. It wasn't much, but it was a start, my start. From there, the steps came quietly. I updated the passwords on my email and cloud storage, each click sealing off another door Mark had walked through for years without knocking. I ordered a small fireproof lockbox for the back office of the store, its purpose hidden in plain sight under a stack of old tax files. The key was to move without changing the rhythm he expected. At home, I still cooked dinner, asked about his day, nodded in the right places. At the store, I chatted with customers, rearranged displays, hosted the weekly book club like nothing was different. But in the spaces between, I was building something he couldn't see. Chloe was my only co-conspirator. We met twice a week after her shifts at the clinic, sitting in the corner booth of a quiet diner that smelled of frying onions and coffee. She'd slide me manila envelopes, printouts, receipts, bits of overheard conversations from staff at the resort. I'd pass her my updates, copies of emails, bank transactions, the growing timeline. One evening, she leaned across the table, her expression sharp. "You know he's been asking about the shop's lease." I nodded. "He's looking for a weak point." "Don't give him one," she said. "Not even a loose thread." Back at the store, I took her advice literally. I went through every document in my filing cabinet, making sure the lease was current, the insurance paid, the utility bills on auto pay. I backed up everything twice. Once to an external drive I kept in the lockbox, and once to the cloud account only I could access. At night, when Mark's breathing settled into its familiar rhythm, I'd slip out of bed and sit at the kitchen table with my folder. The quiet was absolute except for the ticking clock. I refined the timeline, highlighting key dates, cross-referencing them with bank statements and Chloe's notes. The story was there, in black and white, each piece fitting snugly against the next. By Thursday, I realized I wasn't just preparing for defense. I was laying the groundwork to take back control. This wasn't about waiting for him to strike. It was about moving first, on my terms. That afternoon, a longtime customer stopped by, a retired teacher named Helen who'd been with the store since day one. She lingered after making her purchase, her sharp eyes flicking toward the door before she spoke. "I've heard some things," she said quietly. "About you. About the shop. I didn't ask what, I just said, people talk." She gave a slow nod. "They do, but I know better." Her words stayed with me after she left, warm against the cold edges of the week. There were still people who saw me, really saw me, and that meant when the time came, I wouldn't be telling my story into a void. I'd have witnesses. For now, though, the plan stayed silent. Quiet was my cover, and I wore it like armor. The next step was to separate the essentials from the noise. I started carrying a small leather-bound notebook in my bag. Nothing fancy, just big enough to jot down dates, names, and short descriptions. If Mark said something in passing that hinted at his plans, I wrote it down. If a conversation at the store mentioned him, I noted it. The trick was to keep the entries bland enough that, if anyone found it, it would look like nothing more than a personal to-do list. One entry read, "June 12 M dinner, W. RMP, asked about lease terms." Another, "June 18 bank transfer flagged, check follow-up." Patterns emerged faster than I expected. Mark's late nights weren't random. They lined up neatly with resort events, meetings with specific colleagues, and, more tellingly, dates when large withdrawals left our joint account. I cross-referenced them with Chloe's intel, the pieces falling into place like a jigsaw I hadn't realized I'd been assembling. To keep my mind clear, I began arriving at the store an hour early. In those quiet mornings, with the air still cool and the street outside nearly empty, I'd sit in the reading nook and go over my notes. The smell of paper and coffee from the bakery next door was grounding, a reminder that this was mine. Built with my hours, my energy, my persistence. One morning, as I locked the front door after closing, I spotted Mark across the street, talking to a man in a dark suit. They didn't notice me. Mark gestured toward the building, his hand sweeping over the facade like a realtor showing off a prime listing. My grip tightened on the keys. I walked the other way, my steps steady even as my pulse raced. That night I didn't mention what I'd seen. Instead, I sent Chloe a message. "Saw him outside, Dell's a man in suit, pointing to shop. Get me a name if you can." She replied within minutes, on it. By the end of the week, she had it. One of the investors from the email thread. Proof that his private conversations were moving into the open. I added it to the folder, sliding the page in with the rest. The weight of that folder had become almost physical, like it carried the pressure of the entire plan inside it. And maybe it did. Every piece was a small, deliberate step toward a moment I was no longer afraid of. Sunday night, I spread everything out on the kitchen table. Bank statements on the left, emails and screenshots in the middle, notes and witness statements on the right. It looked clinical, like a case file. It was the opposite of chaos. It was order, my order. I knew the time to act was coming. But I also knew patience was part of the plan. If I moved too soon, I risked warning him. If I waited just long enough, I could make sure the blow landed where it needed to, and left no room for him to recover. When I finally gathered the papers back into the folder, I felt a stillness I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was the knowledge that I had moved from defense to offense, and that changed everything. So tell me, if you had the choice between striking fast or waiting until every piece was exactly where you wanted it, which would you choose? I'm curious how you'd play it. The town's annual community fundraiser was the kind of event that pulled everyone out of their homes, even in bad weather. This year, the theme was coastal heritage, with booths lining the boardwalk, live music, and a silent auction in the community hall. I'd been invited to donate a basket from the bookstore, signed novels, a journal, and a gift card. Mark, naturally, was on the planning committee, the kind of position that let him work the room while polishing his reputation. By the time I arrived with my donation, the air was thick with the smell of kettle corn and salt water. The distant sound of gulls cut through the hum of voices. Inside the hall, strings of lights crisscrossed the ceiling, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. Long tables displayed baskets from local businesses, each with a bidding sheet clipped to the front. Mark was near the front, laughing with a cluster of resort donors. He wore his navy sport coat, the one he kept for important occasions. When he spotted me, his smile tightened. "Oh, you made it," he said, as if I'd wandered in uninvited. I set the bookstore basket on the auction table. Wouldn't miss it. As the evening wore on, I mingled. Just enough to be seen, but not enough to give him an opening. Chloe was there, working the volunteer table, and gave me a small nod when our eyes met. In her bag was a copy of the folder, tucked between stacks of event programs. Tonight wasn't about confrontation in a corner or behind closed doors. Tonight was about witnesses. Halfway through the evening, Mark took the stage to thank sponsors. His voice was smooth, confident, drawing polite applause at all the right moments. I stood near the back, the folder's contents replaying in my mind like a private film reel. Then he made his mistake. "We're lucky to have so many thriving businesses here in Cannon Beach," he said, glancing toward me. "Even the smaller passion projects bring color to our community." The crowd chuckled, light and harmless to those who didn't know better. But I could feel the heat rise in my chest. When the applause faded, I stepped forward. "Can I add something to that?" My voice carried just enough to turn a few heads. Mark blinked, surprised, but handed me the microphone with a practiced smile. Of course. I took it, the weight solid in my hand. "Some of you know me from Isabella's Nook. You've been customers, neighbors, friends. What you might not know is that my store, my livelihood, has been under threat for months. Not from a lack of sales. Not from the economy, but from someone who should have been on my side." The room shifted. Conversation stilled. From the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe step closer, her presence steady. I pulled a sheet of paper from my bag. "I have emails here. Bank records. Notes from conversations I wasn't meant to hear. Proof that someone's been planning to sell my store's property out from under me, while telling others I'm falling behind and can't keep up." Mark's voice cut in, tight. "Eyes, this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I said, meeting his eyes. "Because you've been doing it in front of people for years, Mark. The little jokes, the digs, the stories that made me small so you could look bigger. And you thought no one would say anything, but I'm saying it now." I handed the first page to the event coordinator, who scanned it before passing it to the person beside her. A ripple went through the crowd as the paper moved from hand to hand. "This," I continued, "is a message from Mark to a potential investor, describing how he could convince me to sell if I fell behind on bills. Here are the bank withdrawals, unauthorized, from our joint account. And here's the list of dates when those withdrawals match his private meetings." Someone near the front let out a low whistle. Mark's face had gone pale, his jaw tight. I lowered the microphone slightly. "You wanted an audience, Mark. Now you have one." For a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the faint creak of the wooden floor under shifting feet. Mark stood frozen near the front, one hand gripping the edge of the podium, the other hanging uselessly at his side. His sport coat suddenly looked too tight across his shoulders. Those documents are taken out of context, he finally said, his voice straining for calm. This is a public event, Isabella. We should discuss this privately. I stepped closer to the stage, my heels tapping against the floor. Context. Fine, let's add some. I reached into my bag and pulled out a second sheet. Chloe's notes. Dates of overheard conversations with resort staff. These are the times you spoke to investors about replacing my store with a cafe expansion. And these are the receipts for dinners you called client meetings. Paid from our joint account. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed. A man in the second row leaned toward his wife, whispering something that made her frown. I supported you, I said, my voice steady. I built our home life so you could chase every opportunity, and I built my business from nothing, and you decided the reward for that would be to strip it away. Mark's smile was gone now, replaced with a tight, brittle expression. You've always been dramatic. Behind me, Chloe spoke up from the volunteer table. I've seen the emails too, she said, her tone clear and even. They're real. That seemed to break something in the room. People shifted toward me, not away. Helen, my retired teacher customer, stepped forward. I've been in her shop every week. She's keeping that place alive on grit and heart, not handouts. Whatever you've been telling people, Mark, it isn't true. The event coordinator glanced between us, clearly unsure whether to step in. But the crowd didn't look angry at me. They looked disappointed in him. Mark's hands tightened on the podium. You're humiliating yourself. I let out a small breath. No, Mark. You did that. I'm just done letting you do it quietly. I placed the microphone back on its stand and walked away from the stage, leaving the folder with the coordinator. The papers inside were all copies. The originals were safe. As I moved through the crowd, people made space for me, some offering small nods or quick squeezes of my hand. Chloe fell in beside me without a word. Outside, the night air hit me like a clean wave. Cool and bracing, the muffled sounds of the fundraiser filtered through the closed doors, but I didn't look back. For the first time in months, I felt taller. We walked to my car, the boardwalk lights casting soft shadows on the pavement. Chloe glanced at me. You know that was just the first step, right? I know, I said. But it was the one I needed to take in front of them. She smiled faintly. You took away his audience. I drove home with the windows cracked, the ocean's roar steady in the distance. The house was dark when I arrived. Mark wouldn't come home right away, maybe not at all tonight. I didn't care. My folder was safe, my story was out, and the truth had a way of sticking in small towns. In the quiet of my bedroom, I pulled out my notebook and added a final entry for the day, a July 23 public disclosure. Witnesses present. Reaction majority supportive. It was clinical, but it was also satisfying. Every line in that notebook was a step toward something bigger than revenge. It was toward freedom. I didn't know what the fallout would look like yet. There would be conversations, denials, maybe even attempts to spin it back on me. But I'd done what I came to do. I'd taken control of the narrative. And I knew exactly where I'd go from here. So tell me, if you had the chance to lay everything bare in front of the very people someone was trying to impress, would you take it? Or would you wait for a quieter moment to settle the score? I read every word you send. Mark didn't come home the night of the fundraiser. I woke to an empty side of the bed, the sheets still neat where he'd left them untouched. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, the air in the room carrying the faint scent of salt and last night's cool breeze. The silence was different, less like absence, more like a pause before something inevitable. By mid-morning, Chloe stopped by the store. She brought coffee, her scrub still faintly smelling of antiseptic. Heard from him? She asked. I shook my head. And I'm not going to chase him. She nodded slowly. Smart. Let him make the next move. Whatever it is, you've got the truth on your side. Customers trickled in that morning, more than usual for a Monday. Some came just to browse, others to buy. but a few made a point of stopping at the counter to say, "Saw you last night. Good for you." Or, "About time someone said it." Their voices were quiet, but there was no mistaking the intent. The story had already moved through town, the way stories do here, fast and without losing too many details. Around noon, I stepped into the back office to check the store phone messages. 2 hang-ups, one from an unknown number, and one clipped message from Mark. "We need to talk. Call me." His voice was tight, like he'd been grinding his teeth. I deleted it and went back to shelving new arrivals. That evening, as I locked up, Helen from down the block stopped in. She leaned on her cane, her eyes bright. "Don't let him make you feel small again," she said simply, and left before I could answer. Her words settled on me like a warm shawl. At home, the answering machine blinked red. Another message from Mark, longer this time, insisting we meet. To clear the air. I didn't call back. I reheated leftover soup, ate at the kitchen table, and listened to the steady crash of waves through the open window. The next day, I saw his car in the driveway when I came home from the store. He was inside, sitting at the kitchen counter, a glass of water in front of him. "We should talk," he said as soon as I walked in. I set my bag down. "Talk, not spin. If you're here to defend yourself, you can save it." His jaw flexed. "You embarrassed me. You set the stage yourself?" I said. "I just used your microphone." He leaned back, exhaling hard. "You've turned people against me." "They saw the truth, Mark." "I didn't turn anyone. You did." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd had. Finally, he stood, muttered something about staying at a friend's place, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there, my hands braced on the counter, feeling the quiet settle into my bones. That night, I moved his remaining clothes into a guest room closet. Not as a dramatic gesture, but because I needed the space. I needed to breathe without the smell of his cologne clinging to my side of the wardrobe. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still and dim, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I brewed coffee, the rich scent filling the kitchen, and sat at the table with my leather-bound notebook. My pen moved slowly, logging the previous day's events in the same clear, factual tone I'd used all along. When the phone rang, I let it go to voicemail. Mark's voice came through the machine again. Measured this time, almost tentative. "We should meet to discuss the future of everything." I poured a second cup of coffee and erased the message without listening to the end. At the store, the rhythm of work felt steadier than it had in months. I rearranged the front display with new summer titles, the scent of fresh paper mingling with the faint sweetness from the bakery next door. Customers stopped in, and a few lingered longer than necessary, their conversations gentle but deliberate. One man said quietly, "Took guts, what you did." My sister went through something similar. She didn't speak up soon enough. It struck me how many people carried their own quiet battles, how many recognized a piece of themselves in my stand. Mid-afternoon, Chloe appeared, leaning on the counter. "Word is, Mark's been avoiding the resort this week," she said. "He's not taking it well." "That's not my problem anymore," I replied. Saying it out loud felt like pushing open a door I'd been holding shut for too long. Later that day, I walked the beach after closing, the sand cool under my feet. The horizon stretched wide and endless, gulls wheeling overhead. For the first time in ages, I let myself imagine what life might look like without the constant calculations. What to say, when to say it, how to keep the peace. I realized peace was never in my control while I was still trying to manage his storms. That evening, I boxed up a few of Mark's personal things he'd left scattered around the living room. His golf clubs, a stack of magazines, a jacket draped over the back of the couch. I set the box by the door. When he came to collect them, I didn't plan on a conversation. I didn't owe him one. Before bed, I opened my notebook again and wrote just one line. I can hear myself think again. The weight in my chest was lighter, the air in the house felt different. And for the first time, I could sense the shape of what came next. Not as an abstract hope, but as something I would choose, piece by piece, without anyone else's permission. A year later, Cannon Beach was still the same in the ways that mattered. The salt wind rolling off the Pacific, the gulls swooping low over the boardwalk, the steady rhythm of the tide. But for me, everything had shifted. Isabella's nook had survived the winter and then some. The front window now displayed bright paperbacks for summer tourists alongside a chalkboard sign listing our weekly events: poetry nights, children's story hour, and the new memoir writing workshop that always sold out. The air inside carried the scent of paper and coffee, with the occasional hint of cinnamon drifting in from the bakery next door. Mark hadn't returned to the store since the night of the fundraiser. The divorce papers were signed in early spring, and the property deed, my bookstore's home, was now solely in my name. The lockbox sat in my back office, still holding the original folder of documents, though I rarely looked at it. Its weight had shifted from evidence to reminder of how far I'd come, of what I'd reclaimed. On a clear Saturday morning, Liam and I walked down to the shoreline. He was taller now, his voice deeper, but when he grinned, I could still see the boy who'd stood up for me that night in the community hall. The sand was cool under our feet, damp from the receding tide. "You ever think about that night?" he asked, tossing a smooth stone into the water. "Sometimes," I said. "But not the way I used to. It's not the night that matters now. It's what came after." He nodded, watching the ripples fade. "You're different, happier." "I am," I said, smiling at him. Because I stopped waiting for someone else to see my worth before I claimed it myself. Back at the store, Helen was in her usual corner chair, a stack of books beside her. She greeted us with a wave, her cane leaning against the wall. "I hear you're hosting another reading next week," she said. "I'll bring my neighbor. She could use a little inspiration." "That's the goal," I replied, one story at a time. In the quiet moments between customers, I found myself reflecting on the strange way healing works. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It moves in small shifts. Like realizing you haven't thought about the hurt for a whole morning, or catching yourself laughing without reservation. Some evenings, after closing, I'd walk the beach alone. The horizon stretched endless, the air sharp with salt. I'd think about the years I'd spent shrinking my voice, the nights I'd stayed awake trying to figure out how to keep the peace. And then I'd think about the moment that broke the pattern. Liam's voice cutting through the noise. And how it set everything else in motion. People still ask if I regret airing it all in public. I tell them no. Truth doesn't expire in the dark, it just gets heavier to carry. Letting it out was the first step toward setting it down. This year, I started a scholarship fund for local teens interested in writing or small business. We named it the Nook Legacy Fund. The first recipient, a 17-year-old named Maya, wants to open her own cafe bookstore one day. When she told me that, I felt a kind of quiet pride that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. One evening in late summer, I stood at the front door of the shop, locking up as the sun dipped low, staining the water gold. Chloe stopped by on her way home, leaning in the doorway with that familiar half-smile. "You've built something solid here," she said. "With help?" I replied, and meant it. The truth is, healing didn't make me someone new. It brought me back to the person I was before the erosion started. The woman who danced in the kitchen to 90s songs, who dreamed about a shop filled with stories, who believed in her own resilience. As I turned the sign to closed and stepped into the cool evening air, I felt that resilience in my bones. Whatever storms came next, I knew I could stand through them. Not because someone else would shield me, but because I'd learned how to hold my ground. And maybe that's the legacy worth leaving, not just the store or the scholarship, but the proof that you can start again and build something stronger than what was taken from you.